Yo. Welcome back to Son of a Preacher Man. As always, I'm your host. Soapman is in the house. So, a wise man told me, Soapman, be concise. Another wise man told me, Soapman, be polite. And I'm going to attempt to do both. Okay, so the question before us is, why does in Genesis chapter 1 verse 26, does the Bible say, and God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let him have dominion over the fish of the sea. Now, the main part of this passage we want to focus on is, why does God say, let us make man in our image? See, it's those two words, us and our, that throws a lot of people off. Why would God refer to himself in a plural sense, as in there's more than one of him? And this question stumps a lot of people. Let me tell you, this comes up and it stumps a lot of people, and they just skip it. Like so many parts in the Bible that you may come to, people skip what they don't understand. But in this episode, very shortly, I'm going to explain to you why God refers to himself in a plural form in that passage. So it says, and God said, let us make man in our image. And I'm going to tell you why. I'm not going to waste time or delay, okay? So here's the reason why the Bible says, and God said, let us make man in our image. But before I tell you, I just got to warn you, you're not going to like the answer, okay? Okay, so here we go. The reason that the Bible says, and God said, let us make man in our image, is because the people who wrote this story believed in many gods. Let me explain further. We get the story about the creation of man from Moses. Okay, follow along closely. The creation story involving Adam and Eve that you're familiar with comes from Moses. But this isn't Moses' story. Moses is not the original author of the Adam and Eve story. Okay, look at me for a second. Let me see if I can explain this. And I know you probably upset with me, because if you only read the Bible and you have no other outside information or resource other than the Bible, you're not going to fully understand the Bible. Okay? So, we get the creation story from Moses. But Moses was not around at the time of Adam and Eve. The story of Adam and Eve comes from a people called the Sumerians. So imagine this. Pretend like you lived 2,000 years before I did, and you wrote a story. Then 2,000 years later, I come along, I tell a story, and I include the story that you wrote. Well, that's what happened. When Moses comes along and tells the creation story has already been in existence for thousands of years. And that creation story came from the Sumerians. Moses is the author of the creation story that we're familiar with in the Bible. But Moses is not, N-O-T, not the original author of the creation story. So the Sumerians believed in many gods, okay? And so when they wrote the story of how man was created, they said, and God said, let us make man in our image, because the authors of the original story believed in many gods. And so they believed there were a number of gods who had a hand in the creation of man. That's why it says us and our. Now, we talked about the Sumerians a little bit in my last episode, and we're going to be talking about the Sumerians a lot in coming episodes because they have a lot to do. They have a big role to play in finding the evidence of Adam and Eve. So we talked in my last episode and probably the episode before that about the ancient people called the Sumerians. They came from a place called Mesopotamia, and we now know that to be modern day southern Iraq. So we were looking for evidence of Adam and Eve. The Bible says a river ran through the Garden of Eden, which is where Adam and Eve supposedly lived. The Bible says a river ran through the Garden of Eden and split into four, and that two of the rivers were the Tigris and Euphrates River. Well, when we find the Tigris and Euphrates River, as you see here on the map I've provided for you, it does indeed exist. It exists to this day in modern day Iraq, thousands of years ago, as far back as 3500 BCE. That place, which is today called Iraq, was known as Mesopotamia. And southern Mesopotamia was known as the land of Sumer. And just north of Sumer was the land of Akkad, which would eventually become known as Babylon. But it's these people in Sumer that we want to focus on, because these people lived in and around the area that the Garden of Eden is said to have been. Now, I know you may not care about this, what I'm saying. You may not care about the Sumerians. Look, a lot of people don't like to learn stuff, new stuff, and start all over. But if you're going to really understand the story of Adam and Eve, you have to find out and learn and become familiar with the Sumerians, because they are the authors of the story of Adam and Eve. And if you don't understand the people who wrote the story, you may get confused reading the story. Let me ask you something. Does it matter who writes a story? If someone who is known to be honest writes a story, then the person reading the story can feel a bit of comfort knowing that that person isn't going to lie or lead them astray. But if an abject liar writes a story, you know you have to take everything that you're reading with a grain of salt. You can't trust them. And then you have everyone in between. So what I'm trying to get across to you is who is writing these stories makes a huge difference. When Moses writes a story, you can bet your bottom dollar every morsel of it is true. But if Moses includes someone else's story, that shouldn't be given the same credence as something that Moses wrote. Not saying the story that someone else wrote isn't true, but it's not the same as someone like Moses writing. Say, for instance, the Sumerians were 95% accurate in their historical accounts. There's a 5% difference between 95 and 100%. So if the Sumerians are only 95% accurate and the other 5% are riddled with mistakes and errors, then that's something totally different. As good as the number 95 is, it's not 100. And so when you have errors off by an inch, off by a mile, we all know Moses didn't believe in multiple gods. Moses' signature attribute is that he believed in only one God. So when this part in the creation story that's in the Bible, when it says God said, let us make man out of our image, that's the proof that that ain't Moses writing that. Moses is including and sharing something the Sumerians wrote long before him. He's including it in his work. So we have to talk about the Sumerians. There's no way around it. I understand if you just want to read the Bible only. It makes things more simple. It seems to. But then when you get to a part like when God says us and our, you're confused and you're forced to skip it. But if you understand the people who wrote the story, it makes perfect sense. The Sumerians were brilliant people. They were the first people to do a lot of things. They used the wheel, you know what I mean, to make wagons, to carry goods. They used the wheel, and they were one of the first ones to use the wheel. Well, as far as we know, they were some of the first people to use the wheel for chariots and warfare. They were the first people to have a organized government, schools. They recorded the first war. The Sumerians came upon the scene as this super advanced race that was light years ahead of everybody else save the Egyptians. So I think it's a lot that can be learned from these people who were uniquely brilliant, who were uniquely advanced in primitive times, and just coincidentally happened to live just north of where the Garden of Eden was said to be. Now, the Sumerians, they weren't just, the masters of sophistication and the masters of, warfare and government and learning. They were master architects. They built these enormous step pyramids called ziggurats, and they used them for commercial uses. They used them mainly, the main reason for building this huge structure had to do with worship. They were one of the first civilizations to have an organized religious system, a pantheon of gods that they worshiped, a plethora of gods. The Sumerians worshiped many gods of different hierarchies and different ranks, with the chief god being Anu. Some lesser gods were his sons, and the deities just kept getting lesser and lesser and lesser until you got down to man eventually. But overall, the Sumerians believed in a lot of crazy stuff: angels, demons, and more gods than you can count. So it makes sense when you read what the Sumerians wrote. As brilliant as they were, as sophisticated as they were still primitive people. They were still dummies in a lot of ways. They believed in many gods when they wrote their stories. Animals sometimes talked. Animals sometimes spoke. They spoke of giants, half men, half beasts, half men, half gods. The Sumerians believed in a lot of magical stuff. Even though they were accurate with a lot of things such as building and math and artwork, and they had one of the first writing systems, and we still mimic what they did to this day. The Sumerians were so brilliant that we still to this day continue to build upon and off of what they came up with. They were the first ones to come up with 60 minutes, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 24 hours in a day. They're the ones who came up with the first calendars. They came up with different ways of studying the stars that benefited them greatly, in agriculture. Here's the thing, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, boring you to death, rambling on and on. What you need to understand is this part in the Bible that does not make sense. When the Bible says, and God said, let us make man in our image. What I'm trying to get you to understand is the reason it doesn't make sense is because you don't understand the authors of the story. The original authors of the Adam and Eve story believed in many gods. They believed in talking animals. Let me be honest with you. For real, I don't know if the Sumerians believed in talking animals, but they certainly had talking animals in many of their stories. The Adam and Eve story has talking animals. It was the original authors of the Adam and Eve story were the Sumerians. I mean, unless you go back to Adam himself. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which is the oldest written literature in existence, has talking animals, half men, half beasts, giants, the works. If you're going to understand the story of Adam and Eve, whether it's in the Bible or outside the Bible, you need to understand the people who wrote it and the mindset they had. So another one of the things in the Adam and Eve story is that God made man from the dust of the earth. Now, Moses doesn't dig into too much detail about this, but if you were to read an extra biblical account such as the Sumerian account of how man was made, they go into a lot of detail about how they believe the first man was created. And they say that, the gods used their blood mingled with clay and dirt to form the first man. And yes, it sounds ridiculous, and yes, we know it is not true. We as Christians or as people, of faith only believe in one God. So we know for a fact the Sumerians were incorrect about a great deal. As brilliant as the Sumerians were, they were incorrect about a great deal. And I'll talk about in previous episodes how they didn't understand the creation story. We get the creation story from Moses. Moses got it from the Sumerians, but even the Sumerians were not the original authors of the creation story. The original authors of the creation story were the sons of God, who were Adam's descendants. And I'm not going to get into all that right now. I've discussed it in previous episodes. I just want to focus on this main question, why the Bible uses us and our to refer to God. Now, here's another thing about the Sumerians. They knew the story of Adam and Eve. And here's the proof that they knew the story of Adam and Eve and that they were the original authors of the story of Adam and Eve. If this slide that I'm putting up for you right now was found between 2200 and 2000 BCE in southern Mesopotamia. In around 2200 to 2000 BCE, the Sumerians had a firm grip on power in southern Mesopotamia. They ruled that area from around 4000 BCE to 1750 BCE. So the date of this cylinder seal, and what a cylinder seal is, let me just explain. The Sumerians, and they were one of the first ones to start doing this, they would make impressions in a stone or in a piece of wood that was cylindrical, was cylinder shaped. And then they would roll that stone or piece of wood with those impressions or shapes across wet clay or wet mud. And then they would let it dry in the sand. And so you would have these emblems or images, impressioned and hardened in this dry mud or dry clay. Now, the slide that I'm showing you, it's really blurry and it's hard to see, which really lends to its authenticity. It's thousands of years old. But what I have, here's a better slide. I don't know if you can see this, but let me explain this slide to you. It's only gonna take 30 seconds. What you see here is a man and a woman sitting with a tree in between them. Behind the woman, a serpent is slithering behind her. And this tree in between the two is bearing fruit. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a relief made by the Sumerians depicting the story of Adam and Eve. Let me explain something. Long before people wrote, they drew. Before there were letters, words, and sentences and punctuation marks, there were pictures and images, and this is how people communicated. The Sumerians were some of the first people to start doing this, other than the Egyptians with their hieroglyphs. But this is how people told stories. This cylinder seal, this Sumerian relief, is the story of Adam and Eve. Here's a drawing that's a recreation of the cylinder seal, so that you can see everything more clearly. You see the guy to the right, who I'm willing to bet is Adam, is wearing bull horns. The reason he's wearing bull horns is to let you know that he's in charge. He's the head honcho. Bulls were revered in ancient times. They were worshipped as gods. And so you could see this pagan belief intruding into the very story of Adam and Eve. This is the mindset of the Sumerians. They're aware of the Adam and Eve story. You see this guy to the right wearing a bull's horn. You see this woman to the left, and there's a serpent slithering up behind her. Between the two is a tree bearing fruit. Now, if you know the story of Adam and Eve, if you're anywhere at all familiar with the story of Adam and Eve, then you know what you are looking at is the story of Adam and Eve, told by the Sumerians, the people who lived north of them. That's why, in my opinion, it's so important to see what the Sumerians know. They were northern neighbors of the Garden of Eden. It's important to see what they know. It's important to pick their brain in order to ascertain the truth. Even if some of their truth has errors, they are the ones to talk to, because just by way of their proximity to the Garden of Eden. In my next episode, I'm going to introduce you to the Sumerian king list. The Sumerians provide a detailed list of their kings, starting from the very first king, and they go down through hundreds of their kings. So we'll take a look at that in my next episode. We'll start to take a look at the Sumerian king list. We're really hunting for Adam and Eve, and we're following a breadcrumb trail of evidence in order to do it. So I think I introduced the Sumerian king list towards the end of my next episode, but I hope this episode I've answered the question of why the Bible says, let us make man in our image. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for joining me for this episode of Son of a Preacher Man. If you got any likes, dislikes, comments, or insults, leave them in the comments section. If you want to chop it up with the Soapman or want me to discuss a topic that you're interested in, leave it in the comments section. Until next time, I'll see you next time. Same soap time, same soap channel. We out.